For centuries, history books told us King Henry VIII was resting peacefully in a royal vault. They were wrong. When a group of workers accidentally punched a hole in the chapel floor, they did not find a king sleeping in state. They found a disaster scene. The coffin was shattered. The body was not where it was supposed to be, and there was a dark, hardened puddle on the floor that matched a 300-year-old rumor. What they saw inside that vault changed everything we thought we knew about the Tudors. The Tomb of Horrors. When a surveyor finally descended into that darkness with a lantern, he did not find a peaceful royal burial. He found a scene of total destruction. The vault was a mess. It looked less like a tomb and more like the site of a violent struggle. The massive lead coffin, which weighed well over 1,000 pounds, was smashed. It had split open. There were cracks running down the metal, and the whole thing was tilted at a crazy angle. But here is the catch. The damage did not come from the outside. It came from the inside. The pressure within that sealed lead box had built up to such an extreme level that the metal actually tore apart. It was like a slow-motion explosion that had happened in the dark, with no one around to hear it, and the result was horrific. The surveyor saw something that made his stomach turn. Sticking out of the jagged hole in the lead was a massive human bone. It was thick, heavy, and undeniably part of the king's leg. It gets crazier. As the lantern light swept across the damp floor of the vault, it picked up other things. There were smaller bones scattered in the dust. Finger bones, pieces of a hand. It looked like the King of England had literally fallen apart. The crazy part is that Henry was not alone down there. On one side lay his favorite wife, Jane Seymour. Her coffin was perfect, untouched. On the other side lay Charles I, the king who lost his head. His coffin was old, but it held together. Henry was the only one who had been destroyed. It was as if his own body had turned against him even after death. Everyone is obsessed with the glamour of the Tudors, but the reality of Henry's tomb was grim. The surveyor noted a dark, dried substance on the floor near the cracks in the coffin. It looked like old fluid that had leaked out and hardened over centuries. It matched the terrifying stories that people had whispered during the funeral procession 300 years earlier. But the biggest shock was yet to come. In the corner of the vault, hidden in the shadows, the light caught something that should not have been there. It was not part of Henry. It was not Jane. It was not Charles. It was a completely different set of remains. There was no nameplate, no record, just a pile of mystery bones sitting in the most famous royal vault in England. The discovery turned a simple historical survey into a cold case investigation. Who was this intruder? And how did Henry, the most powerful man in English history, end up in a shattered box in a crowded hole? To understand how it ended this badly, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to look at the last days of the king, because the nightmare did not start in the tomb. It started while he was still breathing. The leaking procession. Henry VIII spent the last years of his life in a state that shocked everyone around him. If you look at his early portraits, he was a linebacker, tall, athletic, strong. But by the end, he was a wreck. Reports from the Tudor court describe a ruler who could barely move without help. His once athletic body had grown so massive that he weighed nearly 400 pounds. His staff had to build special lifting devices just to hoist him out of bed. It was basically a wooden crane for a human being. But the weight was not the main problem. It was the legs. His legs were covered in deep, weeping ulcers that refused to heal. This was likely due to a lack of circulation or perhaps type 2 diabetes, though doctors back then had no clue what that was. They just knew it was bad. According to eyewitness accounts, the smell from the infected wounds was unbearable. It filled entire rooms before he even entered. You could smell the king coming before you saw him. Some physicians later suggested he may have suffered from a metabolic condition or a genetic disorder called McLeod syndrome. This could explain the weight gain, the leg issues, and even the paranoia that made him chop off so many heads. But that remains speculation. What is certain is that his body was failing rapidly. He lived in constant pain. Several courtiers wrote that he looked close to death long before he actually took his final breath. When Henry died in January 1547, the embalmers faced a nightmare. Tudor embalming was not exactly a science. It was more like a kitchen recipe. They used spices, oils, wax, and layers of linen to try and stop the body from rotting. But Henry's body was already breaking down while he was alive. The fluids, the infection, the sheer mass of him. It was too much for the primitive methods they had. They did their best. They wrapped him in waxed cloth and sealed him inside a gigantic lead coffin. Lead was the standard for kings because it was supposed to keep everything inside. The smell, the fluids, and the gases. They soldered the seams shut, making it airtight. But here is the thing about airtight containers and decomposing organic matter. It creates gas, a lot of it. And if that gas has nowhere to go, it builds pressure. The coffin turned into a bomb. The trouble began during the funeral procession. The plan was to move the body from London to Windsor Castle. It was a long journey, and the roads were bumpy. On the way, the procession stopped for the night at Sion Abbey. This was a religious house that Henry had treated terribly during his reign. According to several accounts, something disturbing happened that night. The coffin was sitting in the middle of the church. In the quiet of the evening, people heard strange noises coming from the box. Creaking, groaning. Then, they saw a dark fluid seeping out of the soldered seams and pooling onto the stone floor. It gets worse. Some chroniclers claim that stray dogs found their way into the church. Before anyone could stop them, the dogs started licking up the fluid that had leaked from the king. People were horrified. They saw it as a divine judgment. There was an old prophecy that said dogs would lick Henry's blood, just like they did to the biblical villain Ahab. Whether the dog part is 100% true or just a dramatic story added later, it shows how freaked out people were. They knew the body was unstable. They cleaned up the mess, resealed the coffin as best they could, and hurried to Windsor. They wanted to get him underground before anything else happened. Henry was placed in a temporary vault in the center of the chapel. It was never meant to be his forever home. He was supposed to move. Jane Seymour was already down there waiting for him. But even as they lowered that massive leaking lead box into the dark, there were quiet concerns. Some attendants felt the burial was rushed. They worried the lead was already weakening, but they lowered the stone slab and walked away. They thought the problem was solved. They had no idea that the pressure inside that box was still building. And while Henry's body was causing problems below ground, an even stranger story was happening above ground. It was about the tomb he was supposed to have, the one that vanished. The tomb that never was. Henry VIII did not just want a tomb. He wanted a monument that would crush every other royal burial in England. He had an ego the size of a planet, and he wanted his final resting place to reflect that. His father, Henry VII, had a beautiful chapel at Westminster Abbey. It was nice, elegant, and respectful. But that was not enough for Henry. He wanted something darker, bigger, and more intimidating. He wanted a tomb that would remind future kings that no one had ever matched his power. And getting this, he did not even design it himself. He stole it. Cardinal Wolsey was once the king's right-hand man. He was incredibly rich and powerful. Wolsey had commissioned a magnificent tomb for himself. He hired Italian sculptors, bought the best black marble, and designed something truly spectacular. But when Wolsey failed to get Henry his divorce, the king turned on him. Wolsey lost everything, including his tomb. Henry looked at the cardinal's unfinished monument and said, "I'll take that." But Henry being Henry, he decided it was too small. He ordered a new design that was basically the Wolsey tomb on steroids. He wanted it to be huge. He planned for it to be topped with a life-size statue of himself on horseback, covered in gold. There were going to be 144 brass statues surrounding it. Think about that. 144 statues. It would have been crowded with saints, angels, and prophets, all looking at Henry. Workshops all over England spent years making parts for this thing. They cast bronze candlesticks that weighed hundreds of pounds. They carved intricate pillars. They made a full-sized effigy of the king while he was still alive, so the face would be perfect. It was going to be the 8th wonder of the world. The sheer amount of gold and metal involved would be worth tens of millions of dollars today. But then, reality hit. War costs money. Henry loved fighting France and Scotland almost as much as he loved getting married. His military campaigns drained the treasury. Payments to the artists started to slow down. Then they stopped. The Italian sculptor got tired of waiting for his paycheck and went home. The unfinished tomb sat in pieces in a warehouse. It was like a giant Lego set that no one knew how to finish. When Henry died, his will gave strict instructions to finish the tomb. He assumed his son, Edward, would do it. But Edward died young. Then came Queen Mary. She had her own problems. Then came Queen Elizabeth I. She was smart with money, and she looked at her father's unfinished, expensive tomb and said, "No thanks." So, what happened to the greatest tomb in English history? It was sold off, piece by piece. The black marble base? It was eventually used for the tomb of Lord Nelson, the naval hero, centuries later. You can actually see it today in St. Paul's Cathedral. The brass statues? Melted down? The gold? Stripped. The monument that was supposed to make Henry immortal was recycled. It simply ceased to exist. This meant Henry was stuck. He was still in that temporary vault in Windsor. The temporary solution became permanent by accident. He was left in a hole in the ground that was too small for his ego, and apparently too small for his coffin. And just when you think it could not get any more crowded or chaotic down there, a political crisis brought a new guest. A dead king was about to be smuggled into Henry's vault in the middle of the night. The Intruder in the Dark. Fast forward about 100 years. It is 1649. England is in chaos. They have just chopped off the head of King Charles I. The people in charge, the parliamentarians, had a big problem. They had a dead king on their hands. They were terrified that if they gave Charles a nice public funeral, his supporters would rally around his grave and start a revolution. They needed to bury him somewhere quiet, secure, and invisible. They chose Windsor Castle. It was a fortress. It was safe. And it was far away from the angry mobs in London. A small group of loyalists brought Charles's body to the castle in the dead of winter. It was snowing. The castle was dark. They had to work fast because they were not really supposed to be making a scene. They started looking for a place to dig. They tapped on the floor of the chapel, listening for a hollow sound. Eventually, they found a spot near the center of the choir. They pried up the stones and looked down. They realized they had stumbled upon the forgotten vault of Henry VIII. It had been sealed for a century. No one had been down there since Henry was dropped in. There was no time to be polite. They had to get Charles underground before anyone changed their mind. They lowered Charles's lead coffin into the small opening. Now remember, this vault was tiny. It was only meant for Henry and Jane. It was cramped. The men were struggling with the heavy weight of the new coffin. It was dark, cold, and slippery. To make room for Charles, they had to shuffle things around. Historical analysis suggests this is when the real damage happened. Henry's coffin was enormous. It was already weakened by the internal pressure and the chemical reaction of his decaying body. When the men tried to wedge Charles in, they likely shoved Henry's coffin. They might have used it as a ledge or a brace. The wooden trestles, the sawhorse things holding Henry up, were old and rotten. Under the force of the new coffin and the rough handling, the wood gave way. Crash. Henry's massive lead coffin slammed to the floor. The impact, combined with the internal gas pressure, was the final straw. The lead split open. The sides buckled. The explosion that the surveyor would see years later likely happened right then or shortly after, due to the shock of the fall. They did not stop to fix it. They pushed Charles into place, right next to the broken king. It is a strange irony. You have Henry VIII, the man who made the monarchy all-powerful, lying next to Charles I, the man who lost that power completely. One expanded the crown, the other destroyed it. And now they were roommates in a dark, broken hole. The men sealed the vault back up. They put the stones back. They left no marker, no name, nothing. Charles vanished into the floor, and the damage to Henry was locked away in the dark. The vault went silent again. The world forgot exactly where it was. It became a rumor, a legend. Until one day, a clumsy workman made a mistake that would expose the whole thing to the world. The unsolved mystery. By the early 1800s, the exact location of Henry's vault was lost again. People knew he was in the chapel somewhere, but nobody had a map. Then came the accident. Workers were doing renovations in the chapel. They were digging a passage to a new royal tomb nearby. While they were hammering away, a section of the floor suddenly collapsed. It was like a scene from a movie. The stones fell inward, and a black void opened up. The workers stopped. They peered into the hole. They saw the glint of gold and velvet. They saw massive coffins. They realized they had accidentally broken into the resting place of the most famous kings in history. This brings us back to that first scene with the surveyor. The official inspection was ordered by the Prince Regent, who loved a good mystery. He wanted to know the truth. The surveyor, Sir Henry Halford, went down. He documented everything. He drew the sketches that we still use today. He confirmed the disaster. Henry's coffin was indeed wrecked. The wooden supports were smashed. The king's bones were exposed to the air. Halford actually picked up one of the bones. He described it as being part of the leg. He noted that there was still a bit of muscle attached to it, which is wild after 300 years. It proves the airtight seal worked for a while before the coffin burst. But there is a detail that is often left out of the history books. A detail that makes you wonder. During the renovation, before the vault was resealed, some people believe souvenirs were taken. There are stories of a piece of Henry's vertebrae being stolen. Some say a finger bone went missing. It was a different time. Archaeology was less science and more treasure hunting. Eventually, the vault was repaired. The bones were placed back in the coffin. The lid was not resealed, but the wood was fixed. They closed the stone slab and put a proper inscription on the floor so no one would lose him again. But the mystery of the extra bones remains. Remember the third set of remains the surveyor found? The loose bones? Some historians think they belong to a very young child, maybe a royal child who died and was slipped in there for safekeeping. Others think they might be the bones of a priest who was buried in that spot centuries before the chapel was even built, and the workers just tossed him back in when they dug the vault for Henry. It is a cold case that will probably never be solved because the royals rarely allow exhumations. But here is the thing that keeps people up at night. The folks watching this video, looking for a deep mystery, need to consider this. What if we are missing a key detail? We assume the damage was just gas and gravity, but some theories suggest the vault was disturbed more than once. Could grave robbers have tried to get in? Did someone try to steal the jewelry that kings were often buried with? The truth is, Henry VIII spent his whole life trying to be the biggest, strongest, most untouchable man on earth. He changed religion for it. He built palaces for it. But in the end, he did not get the giant monument. He did not get the eternal glory. He got a cramped, shared room under the floorboards. He got a coffin that could not hold him. And he got a burial that was messy, broken, and chaotic. It is a reminder that no matter how much power you have, eventually, nature takes over. The king who wanted to be a god ended up as just a pile of bones in a broken box. So, do you think Henry deserved this messy ending? Or was it a tragedy? And who do you think those mystery bones belong to? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this dive into history, hit that like button and subscribe for more dark secrets from the past. Thanks for watching.